Hello everybody, I'm Richard Holdner, and as always, welcome to the channel. Today we've got a shootout between a 5.3 liter and a 6 liter. Wait, I know what you're thinking. Richard, that's not a fair comparison. One of those is a lot bigger than the other. Yes, but we've got a secret. We've got a high output 5.3 liter, the all aluminum L33 rated at 310 horsepower, and we're comparing that to the low man on the totem pole, 6 liter, the LQ4, rated at 310 to 330 horsepower, depending on what year and what camshaft it has. We ran them both naturally aspirated with the same camshaft and Trailblazer SS intake manifold. Then we ran them both with a G42 turbo. How do the two compare? Let's find out. Okay guys, before we get to the dyno results on our 5.3 liter, we need to find out how exactly did we run this thing? What configuration was it in? So we've got an all aluminum 5.3 liter L33, aluminum block, aluminum heads, composite intake manifold. The L33 was originally equipped with an early truck manifold, but we replaced that with the better Trailblazer SS and then added a 92 millimeter fast throttle body, a manual one, not a drive-by-wire. We also replaced the factory camshaft with a low buck truck camshaft from the guys at Richard Holdner Performance. We also upgraded the injectors, and the reason that we did this is we put 1000cc injectors in it. We would eventually be adding the G42 turbo and turning this thing up quite a bit later on, so we wanted to make sure that we had enough injector to control that and have enough fuel for the power output. All of this was controlled with a Holley HP management system. We had the long tube headers, we had the Mazir electric water pump. So we ran this thing first, naturally aspirated. But the question is, first, how much power did it make? Obviously. But let's take a listen. This thing sounded awesome. Okay guys, what do you think? I told you, these things sound awesome. Nothing like hearing a 5.3 like open headers make a rip on the dyno, wide open throttle. But let's take a look and see how much power this thing made. And if we take a look at the power output, the thing did pretty well. Equipped with the low buck truck camshaft, the long tube headers, and obviously tuned with the Holley HP management system. We also ran this thing on E85, and the reason that I did this, even though E85 makes very, very little difference on a naturally aspirated combination, at least on these LS motors, we were eventually going to run boost, so this way I would have the tune properly done before we started adding boost. We ran this thing on E85 and run in this manner with 30 degrees of total timing, which is where the thing wanted to make peak power. It made 439.5 horsepower at 6,000 RPM and made 423.5 foot-pounds of torque at 4,600 RPM. You can see, nice curve. The thing did pretty well. Now let's take a look and see how this compares to the 6 liter LQ4. Okay guys, now that we've taken a look at the 5.3 liter, let's take a look at the 6 liter LQ4. These were originally 9.4 to 1 6 liters. They had a dish piston in them. They have 317 heads, and like the L33, originally came with the early truck manifold and obviously a fairly mild cam, especially for the early ones, and then the later ones stepped up to a little bit better camshaft. That's why we had a variation in the rating between 300 and 330 horsepower for the LQ4. But this one was equipped, first of all, we had to take this thing apart and then put it back together. This motor was a gift from one of the viewers so shout out to Mike for that. We took it apart. It had a couple of rings that were stuck, and we took it apart because I put ring gap in it so that we could run this thing with boost, and also I wanted to mention we did put ring gap in the 5.3 as well. So we took this thing apart, fixed some of the rings that were stuck in position, added ring gap to it, put it back together. You could see a couple of the cylinders here not in perfect shape. We just scuffed those up and cleaned them up and put it all back together. Then, like with the 5.3, we added the low buck truck camshaft from Richard Holdner Performance, and then we reinstalled the heads with head studs and new gaskets on it. We also replaced the early truck manifold with the same Trailblazer SS and fast manifold, and then we popped this thing up on the dyno to see what it would do. So let's take a listen to the 6 liter, and then we'll talk about the results. Like the 5.3, the 6 liter sounds awesome when you're running it at wide open throttle, open headers and stuff. That's kind of the cool thing about running on the dyno, making rips like that. It's pretty cool. But let's get to the results on our 6 liter LQ4 equipped with the low buck truck camshaft, the Trailblazer SS, and 92mm throttle body, open headers, the same way that we ran the 5.3 liter with our Holly. We ran this thing in on E85 and also ran it with the 1000cc injectors. And once we optimized the tune, this thing produced 452 horsepower at 6,100 RPM. And 457 foot-pounds at 4,400 RPM. So you see it did pretty well. It made a little bit more power than the 5.3. In fact, we should go ahead and directly compare the two so you guys can see, even though they're rated comparable and we had the same intake and same camshaft on them. You can see that the 6 liter did indeed make a bit more power. Out at the top, the difference was not very much. We got 439.5 versus at that point 452 horsepower. So a little bit more power, but the thing that I want to point out, and this is very important and will come into play later on when we start adding the turbo to the mix, is that the 6 liter, if we compare the torque, we've got 457 for the 6 liter and 423.5 for the 5.3 liter, but the difference is even greater than that. Down here at 3,500 RPM or so, we have a difference of almost 50 foot-pounds of torque, 46 or 47 foot-pounds. So it's quite a bit, and what that does on the 6 liter, even if they made exactly the same peak power, that wouldn't matter. On the turbo setup, you're going to get a lot more response rate from the bigger 6 liter. It's going to spool the turbo up, which is why we usually recommend the bigger G42 turbo from RichardHoldnerPerformance.com on a 6 liter. If a guy's going for low boost and doesn't want to make a lot of power, the smaller turbo will work on the 6 liter certainly. But this is why the bigger turbo will spool so much better on a 6 liter. And speaking of turbos, let's check that out. Okay guys, now let's take a look at our turbo kit that we ran on both the 5.3 and the 6.0. Basically, we flipped our truck manifolds, the factory truck exhaust manifolds around, and then we attached a dedicated Y pipe. This one was done by Jason over at JT Fab. And the Y pipe merged together, had two 2.5 inch pipes merged together into a single 3-inch V-band. The Y pipe also had 2 provisions for wastegates. In this case, we installed a couple of TurboSmart 45mm hyper gates. And then, as luck would have it, on our G42 turbo, it also featured a turbine side that had a 3-inch V-band on it. So the turbo just bolted right onto this V-band flange. We ran the discharge from the turbo into our ProCharger air-to-water intercooler running dyno water, and then the discharge from the intercooler went into the throttle body. We had a TurboSmart blow-off valve on that. We also had a 3.5-inch exhaust exiting the turbo. We had our oil feed and then our oil drain going to the front cover. So now with our turbo setup ready on the 5.3 liter, let's hear that thing run and see how it did. Okay guys, real quickly, let's take a look at what happened when we added our turbo. We had the G42 turbo from RichardHoldnerPerformance.com. We didn't run a lot of boost on this, so save your comments. I mean, we would eventually run this thing up on the 5.3 over 900 horsepower at like 15 pounds, and it did great. The turbo will support like 1,200 horsepower, but what we wanted to see, and because of a problem that we had with the 6 liter, we only have this comparison at the low boost. So run at, in this case, 5.6 pounds with the turbo on the 5.3 liter. Here's our naturally aspirated combination, and here's what it looked like when we added our turbo combination. We made just over 600 horsepower, like I said, 5.6 pounds, 601 horsepower at 5,900, and 590 foot-pounds of torque at 4,900 RPM. So let's find out how well this combination did on the 6 liter. Okay guys, now let's take a look and see what happened when we ran the same turbo setup, our G42 with the air-to-water intercooler, that same setup basically on the 6 liter with our low buck truck camshaft and Trailblazer SS. Naturally aspirated one, 452 and 457 foot-pounds. Here's what happened when we added the turbo. And you can see we ran into problems. I'm going to be doing a whole video on what happened with the 6-liter, but we made only a few passes with the turbo on this thing. But it made 616 horsepower, and this was at 5.3 pounds, so slightly less boost than with the 5.3 liter. And 628 foot-pounds of torque. But the real comparison here is how did the two things do when they were run naturally aspirated? And we could see that. And then we could see how they compare when we ran the turbo. And you could see when these things were run naturally aspirated, the 6-liter made more low-speed power. They got close up at the top in terms of peak power, where they were within 10 or 15 horsepower at the top. But big changes down low, and exactly the same thing happened once we added boost. We were very comparable in the boost, 5.3 PSI versus 5.6, so 0.4 of a PSI, which is as close as that we could get this thing. But you can see, we see the same things happening NA and under boost. So where one of them is making more torque down low, the 6-liter, we see that same thing happening up top. And this is what I wanted to talk to you about, and this is the important part of this whole discussion, is that the 6-liter will obviously spool up a turbo of any given size much quicker than the smaller 5.3 will, because it makes so much more torque. So at any given boost level, we see that, hey, this thing that had more torque, more power down low, is also going to have more power under boost. I'm Richard Holdner. Please make sure, like, share, subscribe, ring the bell, do all that stuff, and I'll keep testing.